Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think, can you hear me all right?
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
It's wonderful to see you tonight. I'm not seeing many participants yet, so do you think we should give everyone a moment to join and just chat, or should we get
But
started?
my experience with this particular format is that participants are not going to be counted on our end. So there might be
Oh,
people watching right now where we're not seeing the numbers, so to speak.
okay, perfect. Um, so welcome everyone. I'm Leeya Mehta, and I am in Washington, D.C. I am delighted to introduce you to our three other panelists. The the way that we'll do this session today is that we will start by introducing a panelist at a time, starting with Jeni, going on to Maggie, and then to Sandra, and then myself. And we're going to read from our most recent collections and then go around and have a bit of a chat and then close it with some more poems. So let me get started. I'd like to introduce Jeni De La O, who's going to have to say her name. I wish I had the right Spanish accent.
You nailed it.
I did. I did? Oh,
Yes.
nice. Okay. Welcome, Jeni.
Thank you.
I wanted to tell everyone that Jeni's first poetry collection, Sophia's, is forthcoming in 2022. Jeni is an Afro-Cuban poet and storyteller living in Detroit. She's a founding member of the Estuary Collective. Through the collective, Jeni provides free and donation-based programming for emerging writers, including readings, workshops, and craft discussions. That's really amazing. She is managing editor at Kissing Dynamite Poetry and authors the very interesting monthly column, which I've had a chance to look at, called The Poetry Question. And it's in the Brown study at the Poetry Question. And you can find the column on her website, which is available in her author bio. Originally from Hialeah, South Florida, she relocated to Michigan in 2009, where she began performing as a storyteller. You might have heard her on the Moth Radio Hour at the local Grand Slam and national levels. I'm a big fan of the Moth. Been to the one in DC. It's really great.
They're amazing. I had a chance to perform in DC. It was wonderful.
Her most recent work focuses on leveraging elements of visual poetry to transfer the gestural nature of storytelling, into poetics. I highly recommend her wonderful visual poetry. You can go online and have a look at it. It's really interesting. Jeni, would you like to read a poem?
Yes. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Wow.
And just one more thing for our readers tonight. If you would tell us a little bit about the setting that you're in when you start out, where you are, as much as you want to say. And
about where I am right now.
Yeah.
Oh, so I'm I'm in my bedroom in Detroit. So I had a little bit of a back injury a few weeks ago that's kind of put me out. So I am taking this from my room tonight. But I live in Detroit. I live in the Bagley neighborhood, which is just down the street from the U of D campus. And it's an area that's going through a bit of revitalization. It's an area that's currently struggling with gentrification. It's an area that has attracted a lot of investors after a long time of residents who've been here and stuck with the city and dealt with the austerity measures. And now that things are getting better, the big focus is making sure those folks don't lose out and aren't priced out, and that the local art scene, which is so rich and diverse here, isn't sort of supplanted by a bunch of new Johnny come latelys. And when that's something I try to interrogate with myself, because I've only been a part of this community for about 10 years now. So how we show up in spaces and how we take up space is sort of a theme that comes up a lot in my work and is reflective of being here in Detroit.
Thank you. That's very helpful to get a sense of it. Thanks.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
All right, so I'm going to share the opening poem from this collection, Sophia's. And this collection is sort of an examination of what the concept of Latinidad is in the United States. And the entryway into that exploration is the 2014 Emmys. There was a bit with Sofia Vergara and Bruce, I forget his last name, but the president of the Motion Picture Television Association, the people who put on the Emmys. And he had her stand up on a revolving platform and spin on display while giving this speech about how far diversity has come. I know, and a lot of people don't remember that, but as someone who's a hyphenate American and who is a Latina in this space, it was a moment that really resounded for me as a multifaceted representation of a lot of the different layers of what that American construct of Latinidad is. So this is the opening piece. It's called A Transcription. Thank you, Sophia. Close hands. This has been a wonderful year. Turn to Sophia. For, turn back to audience, American television. Lace hands in prayer. And our shows continue to have meaningful cock head towards Sophia, eyes on crowd, impact around the world. To demonstrate, we'd love for you to stand open, hands open like a popper, level with her womb, against her white dress, eyes on his fingers, pause, retract hands, lace fingers, cover abdomen, eyes at her lips, this revolving platform. Cue smile, cue audience laugh, cue reassuring nod, gesture towards the platform. The audience laughs with more of their chests, more of their mouths. We hear teeth. That seems a bit unnecessary. He steps back, eyes on her rear. But if that's how they do it in American television, left hand to fist, eyes on her chest. Pero qué bonito y sabroso, right hand lip at his side, eyes on her rear. Bailan el mambo los mexicanos. The audience roars. He adjusts her gown. Mueven la cintura y los hombros. Hops back to the microphone. Igualito que los cubanos. The Television Academy represents over 19,000 members from all creative professions. Fist blooms to cover the belt buckle. Right hand gives the signal. A finger trailed under the right eye. The platform begins to spin. So that's just an excerpt of that first poem. It appears this month in Maya's Minis on Closed Eye Open, if you'd like to take a look at it visually. And so what we're doing here is just transcribing all of the gestures along with the language of what's happening on the stage. And then the rest of the collection sort of takes those moments and teases them apart and uses other poems in between to explore the many different facets of Latinidad that are sort of put on display in that skit. So that's a translation, a transcription.
Thanks very much, Jenny. I actually watched the video. I don't know if everyone else has seen it. That's fantastic. It just brought in so many ideas about, of course, the ones that you mentioned, and I was intrigued by it, to hear what you had to say. And the title of the book is Sophia's. It's with an apostrophe S.
Yes, so in this, no, it's not with an apostrophe. It's just a plural of Sophia. So yeah. The idea here being the core, this started as a micro where I took Sofia Vergara's opening introduction before she steps on the platform. And I did different erasure techniques. And each one of those Sophias is just her words in different visual techniques to produce different results that examine like I said, various aspects. So there's the performative aspect of it, there's the hypersexuality of it, there's the cost of assimilation of it, but there's also the fact that she's in on the joke and that this is a career move. So there's many facets to it. It's not a one note story, and it lends itself to examine many different strands of the experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to hear from Maggie Smith now. Hi, Maggie. Maggie Smith's newest collection of poems is Goldenrod, which will be released on the 27th of July in a few days. Congratulations, and you can pre-order it either on Simon & Schuster or anywhere you look, you'll find it. She's the award-winning author of Good Bones, The Well Speaks of Its Own Poison, Lamp of the Body, and the national bestseller Keep Moving, Notes on Loss, Creativity, and Change. A 2011 recipient of a creative writing fellowship from the NEA, Smith has also received individual excellence awards from the Ohio Arts Council, 2 Academy of American Poets Prizes, a Pushcart, and fellowships from the Sustainable Arts Foundation and the VCCA, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. She has been widely published, appearing in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Paris Review, the Best American Poetry, and much, much more. Slate called Smith a superpower as a writer. Her ability to find the perfect concrete metaphor for inchoate human emotions and explore it with empathy and honesty. Maggie?
Thank you. I find one's bio so embarrassing. I know that, like it's, yeah, but thank you. Sometimes we think like, do we do those things? Like, do I do those things? I think that was truthful. Thank you. Yeah, so I thought I would read a poem from Goldenrod. And speaking of metaphor and the body, this maybe kind of works. I was at I went to the beach up in the Montauk area recently and collected a bunch of shells for my kids because that's what good moms do. And I was reminded of this poem. It's called Slipper. Last time I sat at the sea's open door, I was 7 months pregnant, my son bobbing inside me and the same roar of waves there. What I love about the sea is its relentless newness, the constant turning over, mornings gray-green, afternoons blue and glassy, the horizon wearing its ridiculous white ruff of clouds. I am becoming my mother here in a skirted one-piece swimsuit, my thighs glistening scallop white and tender, spreading in the beach chair, my kids digging broken shells from the sand at my feet. My daughter gasps to find one whole, a common slipper, also called a boat shell for its shape. Something once lived there, something slick and muscular, a tongue clamped inside. Imagine if I could wear my home and call it my body, wear my body and call it home. Oh, and I'm in Columbus, Ohio, which is where I was born and where I've lived my entire life.
Tell us about that blue telephone behind you.
It's an actual telephone. I have a landline so that my kids could, if I fell and cracked my head open, call 911 without trying to figure out this contraption. And so it doesn't actually have a ringer turned on. Like no one can call it. No one has the number. It is completely non-functional except as an emergency call out line for my kids who could probably get on YouTube quicker on an iPhone than reach emergency help.
Do you live far from your childhood home?
No, my parents still live in my childhood home, and I have Sunday dinner there pretty much every Sunday. So it's about 20 minutes drive from where I am now. My sisters are still here. My aunts and uncles are still here. Like pretty much we are deeply rooted for better or for worse.
Thank you. I think that one of the themes I wanted to talk about as we, go into the chat format after Sandra and my poem will be perhaps optimism. There was optimism in that poem. I felt like tentative optimism. That was quite lovely. Thank you. Um, Sandra Beasley. Sandra Beasley's latest collection of poetry is Made to Explode. It was out in February. Congratulations.
Thank you.
In these poems, Beasley, Sandra, probes memories of growing up in Virginia, in Thomas Jefferson's shadow, where the poet was steeped in the cultural traditions of the American South. Her home in Washington, D.C. inspires prose poems documenting and critiquing our capital's institutions and monuments. Ada Limon called Made to Explode a rare and vibrant exploration of whiteness and complicity when it comes to America's histories and traditions. Sandra is the author of 3 previous poetry collections, including I Was the Jukebox, winner of the Barnard Women's Poetry Prize. She's a recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts and also published a memoir, Don't Kill the Birthday Girl, Tales from an Allergic Life. I could go on, Sandra.
Thank
I'll
you.
stop. I feel like I'll take a cue from Maggie, who seemed stop.
No, that's very kind. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and to be in conversation with these amazing poets. I'm going to read one of those prose poems that is set in and around Washington, D.C. And I would say that in writing Made to Explode, one of the things I really thought about was the fact that we are both, of course, an independent city and the nation's capital. And so things that happen here often have 2 dimensions, if not more. We also were a city that voted very blue, very democratic in the most recent, the most recent election, but also the one before it, and then had to deal with a kind of occupying force with whose views we did not share. And so it was a kind of oppressive time. As much as I love my city, I felt it every day. And this poem is an example of being out and about in the world. And on one hand, crossing paths with a major icon. And on the other hand, you're just one of a number of patrons all sharing the same show at the Shakespeare Theater. It's called Kiss Me. Ruth Bader Ginsburg sits in the 19th row of my heart, while on stage, a woman has been conscribed to the shape of a shrew. The actress has 40-carat eyes, an aquiline nose, her shoulders slight, her waist small enough. She is spanked over our hero's knee. Everyone is laughing, except the conductor, who must steady his baton, and the house manager, who has seen it before, and the actors directed instead to be aghast, agape, gawking, agog, whatever Cole Porter rhymes with dismayed, and Ginsburg, who adjusts the pearl clipped to her ear. She curls the program in her lap. This is tiring, attending theaters of the heart. She doesn't relish it as Sandra Day O'Connor did, sipping Prosecco at the intermission of Porgy and Bess. The gangster's soft shoe reminding us to brush up on our Shakespeare. The actress sings, I am ashamed that women are so simple. Soon Kate will be tamed. That's how we know the ending is happy. Thank you.
Thank you. I remember going to her wake in Washington.
How long did you have to stand in line?
We decided to go across the road and not stand in line. And so we could see everything from the other side of the road. But it was a real sense of mourning, very somber. I think people around us were, especially, people who were part of the law, friends who are lawyers, were extremely sober.
And she's a revered figure, but she's not a perfect figure, just like Sandra Day O'Connor is not a perfect figure. And I think that that's one of the realities of living in a town that so often creates monuments and memorials, is kind of parsing the difference between humans making human and imperfect decisions and these people that we need to hold this value for a society or for a hope of things. Yeah.
That really resonates, having lived here for 15 years now. Look forward to reading more. Thank you. I am the fourth reader, so I shall introduce myself very briefly. I am a fiction writer and essayist, as well as a poet, and I have a column on the writing life and the reading life called The Company We Keep, which runs with the Washington Independent Review of Books. I grew up in Bombay and spent my childhood and middle adulthood there. Moved to Washington about just over 10 years ago. And the physical geography of both cities and how it is, they are metaphors for the intimate space of family and society and race, have always really interested me, both Bombay and Washington. I come from a really small community, sort of a tribe or ethnicity called the Parsis of India, which who trace their origin to Iran, but are very much Indian, in that they moved over 1,000 years from what was Persia to India before it was Iran even. And so they settled in Western India, and there's about 80,000 to 100,000 Parsis left in the world. It's a very specific kind of cultural community, and with a great sense of rootedness. So even though I live here as an immigrant, I have a great sense of rootedness to that ancestry. And my mother lives in Virginia, where I just spent a couple of weeks, and I'm now back in Washington, which is much hotter than Virginia was in the mountains of Virginia. It was really cool and beautiful. I had to wear a sweater in the mornings and sit outside when I was sitting outside and working. And so the poem I'm going to read is from my new collection. That's A Story of the World Before the Fence. And it's called Mother's Day. I have traveled 10,000 miles with you from a small apartment at the edge of the water in a city piled high into the sky, stacks of cement boxes with bathrooms and bedrooms, furniture, people, parrots, dogs, washing machines, and the rare laburnum tree with bunches of gold flowers that breaks the steady state of squalor that marks these still beautiful Bombay streets, to rural Virginia, where in the spring lace white pear trees make the world seem perfect, no underlying hint of violence or suffering to mark what is coming for each of us. When you think of me, irritable, homesick, carrying my burdens badly, burying my laughter deep, don't forget that I see a red cardinal shooting across a brown garden, a piece of blue sky, an orange sunset over a wide river. When I think of you, lonely, too attentive to daytime TV that keeps you connected to the outside world, don't forget that I see the laughter of generations in your heart in languages so old, all human secrets are safe with them, turning yellow and stale with underuse. There are many things that make a life. One of them is love, the acceptance I have of you. But what of laughter, mother? Will it not help when it is the end and there is nothing to mask what is coming for us? What will abide if my children do not know Gujarati and cannot laugh with us at our old family jokes? But then I look around the room and see my children laugh a lot anyway. Like wild flowers, they find a crack in the concrete to burst out and reveal that the time has come to forgive myself for what we have lost and learn to live again in a new country with pear trees. I feel like,
Beautiful.
thank you. I feel like there was so many interesting parallels, and we didn't know what each of us was going to read or talk about. But when we started, Jeni was talking about Hialeah, where she grew up, and how it was a very dense place, and I grew up in a very dense place as well. So kind of probably a little different from the Virginian suburbs. Very different from the Virginian suburbs, but also I noticed, and this is a question I was going to start with the chat hour or the chat half hour, and this is a question for Maggie. Maggie, I've noticed with your work over the years that there's sort of these moments or these glimmers of optimism within the sort of the reality. And given, and this is the question that will go out to everyone, given the year we've had, or the more than the year we've had, the 2 years we've had, coming out of that remarkable poem of yours, Good Bones, in 2016, and that collection that came before your current one. I was wondering if you would like to start us off and talk a little bit about optimism and about this time and the sort of the cultural and political context to some degree, but maybe not so much political, but just the cultural time that you find yourself in. I know it's a very broad question, but optimism. I was just wondering whether you've changed a little bit in your outlook and your optimism, if that's finding its way into your poetry. Where do you gather your inspiration, and then where does it find itself? Where do you let it rest?
Rest is an interesting word, I think. I've been thinking a lot about what I'm doing in the new book in Goldenrod, and I realized the other day that I think the sort of maybe secret invisible ink subtitle to this book is Be Still, which is the exact opposite of the title of my last book. And I think, so much of what I'm trying to do in these poems, and really probably in all of my poems since the beginning of me writing them, is it's about paying attention. And I don't know exactly what that has to do with optimism. I have a really shaky relationship with optimism. I have always been, probably because I'm a poet, like a little bit more on the melancholic side. Like, give me a sad song before you give me a peppy one every single time, and I will just like absorb and like relish the wallow. And that's a place where I go to in my poems. It's that deep thinking, still inner space where I don't actually have to pep talk myself in a poem. I can just feel what I'm feeling, and it might be hard but I do think there is an impulse that is, to me, it feels like a parental impulse, but I think it's a human impulse to find a little bit of light, to find the flower coming up the concrete, as a way of just functioning. Because if it's all bad all the time, we're not productive, either as writers or as people. And yet, on the other side of that, if we do this and don't pay attention to what's actually happening, and try to sort of like force some sort of Pollyanna happy ending on things, to reference Sandra's poem, that's how we know the end is happy, that doesn't work either. So I think, for me, poetry is a space of liminality and being able to hold those opposing things at the same time. And if it weren't that, I don't know that I'd keep doing it. Like I'm interested in working in poetry because it's complicated. That's why I take the complicated stuff there. If I'm just having a good day, I don't need to write about it. I'll just go have my good day. If I'm troubled over something, I'm grabbing my pen and taking it to the page. I don't know if that answers your question.
It really does.
Okay.
It really, and it resonated as well. The idea that you hold a pretty complex set of emotions simultaneously, because I think that one of the questions I sort of had to you and to the rest of the panelists, and this is sort of a lead-on question, is what is our responsibility? Is it to give the pep talk in some ways, or is it to tell it as it is? And to hold that complexity. And I think we're not asking many questions if we're just going to go, really into the pep talk. So I like the way you've described that. I would love to hear if Sandra and Jeni would like to jump in and talk a little bit about, how they're holding space. I know that Jeni writes a lot about it too. So would you like to jump in?
I think, yeah, I would just add that I agree with what Maggie and what you've said, Leeya, about not leaning into an artificial optimism. I think if we're going to talk about what our responsibility is with our readers and with our words, it's to present all possibilities, I think. And possibilities range. I mean, there are negative things, there are bad things, and there are great things, and there are wonderful possibilities. And so I think our job is sort of to present what's here and imagine what can be, and imagine it, for all its glory and for all its faults. I think, I remember being in middle school, and my guidance counselor had a poster on the wall that said, if you keep your face to the sunshine, you'll never see the shadows. And I just remember thinking, if you're constantly looking at the sun, you're going to go blind. Like, it doesn't work that way. So you have to have both. And I think our responsibility is to sort of give people permission to imagine something else.
I love that. That's a great image.
I really appreciate what's already been said. And one thing I'll just add is that going back to publishing, I published a book that was a memoir, but because it was addressing food allergies, which there was an audience for that was just craving a representation of that experience, I got into a lot of conversations where people wanted the book to say one thing. They wanted the book to give them a certain type of experience. And I had to say, it's a memoir, it's not a manual. I'm not going to model the behaviors that you all, particularly parents worried for their allergic children. I can't, that's not the purpose. So in other words, I've had over a decade experience negotiating the difference between who I am on the page and what I do there versus who I can be as an author in the world and as an agent of community and change. And so I think that's really important to say for me, because Made to Explode is a difficult book. I mean, some of the truths that it articulates about history and reality and cultural inheritance are uncomfortable. And I let the poems end in uncomfortable spaces. And yet I do genuinely believe that as a person, I'm not an uncomfortable person. I feel like I really genuinely encourage, and I'm more than happy to celebrate with those around me, this community that we share. I'm not constantly poking the nerve, so to speak. And so I'm comfortable with there being a distance between what I need to do on the page and what I need to do as an author in a shared literary space.
Can you give us an example of that sort of uncomfortable? Sort of leads us into the next area that I wanted to talk about a little bit. But when you say that, what do you mean?
Well, I think that among other things, I'm talking about some of these poems, since we're two people of DC or Northern Virginia, I'm looking back at to me, a self-congratulatory sector of liberal Northern Virginia culture that told itself it was very enlightened and welcoming, and in fact was very actively engaged in micro and macro aggressions against folks of color. And I'm kind of being really pretty specific about things, to the point where people from my past, from high school and college, have said, oh, and you know what? If you recognize yourself in those poems, good. Like, that's something that you should kind of feel that twinge, where you came for the poetry and, oh, look, you're seeing yourself reflected in a way that maybe is not fully comfortable. So yeah, it's pretty specific. I mean, there's one of the news stories that broke out earlier this year was that in some school counties, people were still being tasked with doing role play and small group projects where someone had to quote unquote play the slave, and someone, and I saw more than once someone just, how could that happen? I'm like, well, I know it could happen because it happened in my high school, which was not that long ago. And so yeah, those are some of the uncomfortable things that the poems have to sit with.
And this is a question, sort of a follow-on question about how one narratively deals with talking about race, for example, or gender, where there's a question about who the author is and who the narrator is, and that separation between who we are as individuals and then who our narrators are. And so, of course, there's the idea that you could, people think that the author and the narrator are the same person, and often they are, and often they're not, I suppose. And so, just managing that relationship, and that sense of, again, responsibility, but also the sense of empathy that one has for someone who isn't us as the narrator, and where you feel that conversation has impacted perhaps the way that you write. So I'll give you a very concrete example so that I'm not talking in abstract. So I have a series of poems in my book. It's called Nudes, and it's 4 poems, and they're set in different places. One set in Japan, one set in Virginia, and then 2 are set in Washington, and they're about race and gender. And the 3rd poem, which was published by an African-American editor, is about, it's like a persona poem. It's in the words of, so to speak, or the thoughts of a Black man. And over the years, I've always struggled with the idea that at what point are you allowed to have empathy and to talk in the words of other people who are not you, as a person who isn't necessarily associating in the same way with, a person of privilege, for example, as I think of myself, for example. But, and so where does the persona come in? Where does the narrator come in? And how do you work with that? Or do you work with that? Or do you stay clear of that, especially in the current environment? And if you want to talk about it, is that something that you'd like to comment on, the difference between the narrator, your person, and the persona of the narrator?
I will just say briefly that for my sake, I have stepped aside from appropriating any personae that are not inanimate objects, mythologies, icons, or it can be a sense of the speaker as an exaggerated but I'm not, for me right now, I'm not interested in appropriating any historical persona that just doesn't feel right for me in this moment. But I'm super interested to hear, like, Jeni, it occurs to me that the Sophias, I think this project sounds amazing, by the way. And I'm thinking a little bit of Alison Bennis White and the Wendy's, like just how a name can evoke a kind of space and then hold space. So I don't know if persona comes up at all in that collection, but if it does, maybe you might run with that.
I feel as though persona is something that is a masterful level of craft that I am not anywhere near attempting. And so for myself, when I am drawn through empathy or outrage or even curiosity to a voice that's outside of my own, my practice tends to be to try to read and research and learn. And if I want to write something in that space that I feel hasn't been written yet, and I'm not in a position to platform someone else who's doing that work, which I don't usually get this far along on the checklist, right? There's always someone who's doing the work. And if you can give them a leg up to do that work, you should, because it's an ecosystem. But if you get that far and you can't find someone who's doing the work, then at that point, I try to interrogate what is my relationship to this experience. And I can write from that perspective. What is my relationship to this experience? And why can't I find someone who's writing about this? Why is it difficult? Where's the lack, and how can we address that as a community? Because I don't feel as though it's my particular role in life to speak for someone else. I think that there's plenty in my circle to talk about. What I do think is my role is if something comes to me that's interesting to me, then it's more than likely interesting. I'm not very original. It's got to be interesting to other people too. So let's find who's working in that space and help get them the resources and the platform so that that story can get out there.
The idea of that checklist is wonderful. And Sandra, I appreciate what you said. That was very well said, and appreciated. Yeah. Maggie, did you want to comment on this, or should we move on?
That has been pretty much my my approach to the persona poem, which I love. I mean, I think I have persona poems in at least my first 2 books, but they're biblical characters or invented historical characters. I feel really uncomfortable trying to slip inside someone else's lived experience. If I like the idea of trying to speak for an other makes me uncomfortable. It sort of gives me an eye twitch. And I think whenever we feel like, is this maybe not the right thing? I'm so about listening to that little inner voice. Like, even if I think like, oh, I could write a really interesting poem from the perspective of X, I have to ask myself, like, is that really my microphone to hold? And if the answer is probably not, then I don't write that poem. I maybe write it from a different perspective, or I leave it in my notebook as something that I don't really write about. And something I've been, I think, sort of leaning into in my last couple of books is like getting away from persona even. And I think, maybe that comes from having dabbled a little bit in nonfiction, but just becoming a little bit more comfortable with the speaker of the poem, and the poet being like a little bit more enmeshed. Whereas when I was first writing, I think, in my early 20s, I was like, what do I have to say? I'll write as the wife of Lot. And I think now in my 40s, I think like, well, actually, I have some thoughts on the subject. And maybe I can not sort of cloak myself in this thing and have to hold it away, like have to kind of put these oven mitts on and kind of hold the experience away from myself. Like maybe I can just own it, which can make for some uncomfortable conversations if you are talking about personal relationships or race or class or any sort of like hot issues if you're doing it as yourself. But I find it's also really rewarding in a way that writing about it inside like a puppet is not.
allowing yourself to show up in that space changes the dynamic of the work too. And you mentioned in your 20s it was one thing, and now writing later it's different. And I have found that as well, that as I've gotten older, I feel more comfortable allowing myself to exist within the speaker of the poem, even if the speaker isn't me. And that requires a certain amount of accountability and holding yourself accountable for what's in the work. So it's an interesting thing to observe aging through the writing process and seeing how much more of myself shows up in the work.
I love that. I love that.
I think we might have lost our host.
I think that our moderator had to, let's hope that there's a re-add. I'm curious, since I know that in the discussion of this panel, we talked about kind of community, and I'm just curious if there's anything that anyone wants to share or mention in terms of, it's funny with my bio, the Bernard Women Poets Prize, it was some years ago now, but what I want to mention is that when that happened, it really created a resolve for me that I would mentor women poets or non-binary, or I'm open to, but my point is that I wanted to reach out to those who felt marginalized in terms of their gender, their identity, and really, so even though it was kind of an afterthought, but that was specifically the contest that I got a major publishing breakthrough, it really shifted my thinking about it. I'm just curious if there's anything that anyone wants to say about kind of community building or that type of moving through the literary world while we wait to be rejoined, I hope.
I find it so fascinating. Like, I don't think of myself as like a woman poet, but if you look at my work, it's like, so much of it is about being a woman in the world, and in my later poems being a mother. And I think not just being a parent, but being a mother, which feels like it is like a gendered experience, I think. But I am often, and I remember, particularly in graduate school and as I was starting to publish, like really kind of being cranky about, being anthologized in this way and sort of being penned in a sort of way where it's like, well, I don't know. Maybe that's just me, but I
grabbed onto the example of Elizabeth Bishop, who famously refused to be anthologized as a quote unquote woman poet. So that for me was, I have a lot in common with her on an aesthetic level. And for me, I kind of grabbed that as a clarion call. I'm not sure, I don't think I feel that way now, but but at the time, and in fact, the poem I read, Kiss Me, is in an anthology called Women of Resistance, and so that's shifted for me.
Yeah.
Jenny. Oh, unmute, please.
For me, the anthology question is a little tricky when you're coming sort of from outside institutions and you're not necessarily credentialed. It is a way in, and it's a way to find yourself in company with authors that you might not necessarily find yourself in company with when you're coming as an outsider into the publishing industry. So for myself, being a part of, for example, the Faceless Brown Masks anthology, let me be in community with poets that I otherwise would have never, crossed paths with, and forge connections that allow me to then take those resources back to the poets that I am in community with and help them elevate their craft as well. So in my case, I have found those types of, I don't want to say identity based, but certainly like group focus and efforts that are meant to highlight traditionally underrepresented or marginalized groups have proven to be beneficial in the way that they help expand community for underrepresented and non-credentialed writers.
Thanks for taking over. I'm so sorry. My system just collapsed. I had no idea why. Too hot to handle. I'm feeling sufficiently embarrassed.
No, you're fine.
And so we're discussing our relationship to community building. For me, I feel like it's perhaps at the heart of my relationship with my writing, having the tribe. and feeling at home. And therefore, because it has had such a remarkable impact, and knowing the difference between when you come to a new city and you don't have your tribe in immediate contact with them, and you start searching for them, and other writers are the tribe and readers are to some degree, but mostly it's other writers, and finding a voice in the community. That is so important to my sense of well-being, that it is only with such joy that I want that to happen to anybody else. I mean, whether it's someone who's established or not established, and the idea that you open and create these networks. A friend of mine who's an economist like me was saying that her mother has this idea that you're a good friend. You know how people say, what is the sign of a good friend? And you're a good friend if you multiply the friends on either side. Like, so you introduce friends to each other and you sort of exponentially increase friendship between people and not hold your friends to yourself. And that idea that we are good writers in some ways when we open our worlds to one another and to the table, the community is infinitely large. And I know that we don't have the ability to pay attention to everyone because our days are short, and in some ways social media helps with that. But it is perhaps the most important part of being a woman in the writing community. And I think women are good at it often. And so having women of different ages and different backgrounds, it's pretty incredible. So I'm sure Jeni spoke quite a bit about it too.
Well, you brought up social media too as a sort of community building tool. And I found, I think of myself more as an Ohio writer or a Midwestern writer more than I even think of myself as like a woman poet. I identify very strongly with place and what writing from this place looks like and is concerned with. And so one of the joys for me of a space like Twitter, as problematic as it can be, is seeing Sandra's silver shoes, which I think she's wearing now. In all seriousness, like being able to be in my office, in my hometown where I've lived my whole life, 20 minutes from the hospital where 3 generations of my family were born, and be able to make friends with and learn about work that's being published out there and actually build real relationships, like working relationships. Yes, like, oh, send me a poem or help me edit this book, or I'm editing this anthology and you should submit something. But also just like, oh, are you having a hard day? I have like actual phone conversations with people that I've never met in person. I've only met on Twitter, and we've become actual supports for one another outside of the business of poetry and publishing. And so as problematic as the space can be, I think I don't know, for me it's been really useful and warmer than I think we often think of it.
Yeah, and I like that idea. Space and place and not being limited by a single identity for me has been really important as a writer. And so I have to say I never thought of myself as a woman as much as I have since I moved to the United States, because you're always being told you're a woman, you're the gender perspective, the race perspective, and I don't self-identify as a woman, or as I don't say walk around thinking, oh, I'm a woman. There's so much more to our identities, and I think that it is sometimes oppressive, actually. So I would love to close with a round of thanks and then have you all read a poem. I think we have enough time to do a short poem each. Let's start with Sandra, and then Maggie and Jeni in the reverse order now. So go ahead.
Sure. Speaking of Twitter, another wonderful writer, Amber Sparks, she mentioned like, oh, I learned this really weird thing, which is that when you find an unpuffed kernel of corn, it's called an old maid. I was like, I have a poem about that. Yes, I'm judging by Maggie's shocked face. Yeah, so this poem is in the book because a woman restaurateur said she loved it, and I realized afterwards that even though I thought it in a way I was writing about food, what I really wrote about was the trade-off of do I sell on my sexuality, attractiveness, etc. as a woman, or do I potentially hold back in certain scenarios if that is potentially at the cost of being seen in terms of my talent? It's a very short poem called simply Pop. We call an unpuffed piece the old maid, but she's just the one who read the fine print. Germ and sugar curled in her hard hull, deciding whether to shake out her sheets. Sometimes it's worth it. Pan, oil, flame. Sometimes you must hold the steam within you. Thank you.
That was fantastic.
Oh, I love that.
Great metaphor.
I love that. That kernel knows something that some of the other kernels did not know and should have known. I'm going to read a really short one that sort of uses a sourdough bread metaphor that I picked up by reading a bunch of people's pandemic activities. It's called Prove. I let a thought prove in my head overnight. In the morning, I check to see what's risen. I try to expect nothing, which is exactly what I deserve. What kind of woman demands her head deliver? But sometimes I wake to a thought doubled, tripled in size, and as good sour as anything grown in the dark.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
We're in conversation.
So we had corn and bread. So I'm going to give you a toast. This poem is called Toast to the Daughter of a Disco Diva. This is one of those poems where the speaker and myself are not that far apart. Praise these lips, thick kissing in the moonlight, and praise that old me that danced on tables, loud, beaming, God in a sun setting over Miami, in the jellyfish's fluffy swim, extol me in the manatees' waving belly roll hellos, and in the soft green heat of Florida at dusk. Praise me, peaceful as a sunning gator, dancing on my mother's table and with the table and for the table. And I am dancing with every version of me. The 8-year-old me with a purse full of rocks and the armchair meteorologist me in her 20s, the twisted spine swaying me and the smoke smudge swirling later on me, all stomping for the good hoof of every cow and the discos glittering. And they love me like I love them, and we dance the tender flesh of summer raspberries, and dance is praise, isn't it? We dance the swamps that border us into a burnt offering. Do you know how hard you have to hustle to set a swamp alight? And if she could see us dancing, if my mom could see us at all, she'd unmoor the moon and pin it to our ceiling so our skirts twinkle with every champagne twirl because we're amazing and alive and here and future and dancing and never let the party die.
I like that. Never let the party die. This is Nudes 1, Bathhouse, Hakone, Japan. Once I cross the threshold, I take off my clothes. Mirrors in the room register my body, but for now they're superfluous. Later, when I re-enter the familiar world, I may care how I look, my face perfectly poised at the moment of reflection. I follow the other women to the line of showers, sit on a plastic stool, slowly wash my hair with liquid soap. My body scrubbed, I soak in the bone-hot bath as steam from the springs unseals my pores, peach flowers in bloom. Beyond the windows, mountains, and still lake protect a red core of magma, resting, scalding. All are naked here. I am a recognizable female form of no differentiated quality.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you all. This was just marvelous. Thank you for your honesty and really appreciated being here. Thank you for holding this space together. Sandra, Maggie, Jeni, good night.
Thank you for having me. Good night, everyone.
Night all.